Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So the final day of spoiler season continues on, but don't forget about all the amazing spoilers from yesterday, including Hypnotic Crown of Dawn, which this card is just broken. There's no getting around it. This card is broken. And yeah, to find out exactly what it does and all the broken things that you can do with it, make sure you check that episode out at some point. Also, make sure you check out a much less broken, but a still incredibly awesome card with Containment Construct from this morning. And yeah, this thing is pure madness. Literally. But don't leave just yet until you check out this episode, which you're already watching it, so clearly you checked it out, but just keep watching it. It's last day of spoiler season. I'm everywhere at this point. I'm tripping over my words. The words are tough today. I mean, this card is called Invigorating Hot Springs, so I was going to say, like, this card is hot springs. But then I decided to actually name the episode This Card is on Fire because the Alicia Keys song got stuck in my head. So here we are. So regardless, without me rambling any further than that, let's jump into it. So, really quick, Invigorating Hot Springs, and yeah, actually really quick with that art. That monkey looks very comfortable in those hot springs, and I'm very jealous. Regardless, back to the card, it's an enchantment for 1 red-green. It's going to enter the battlefield with 4+1 counters on it. It says, modified creatures you control have haste, and again, modify is a, new grouping word. I'm not sure exactly how we say it, but kind of like historic, deals with, artifacts, sagas, and legends. Modified means that, your creatures that are modified are ones that either have equipment, or you control on them, or counters on them. Those are considered modifications. And then finally, by removing a +1 counter from Invigorating Springs, you put a +1 counter on target creature you control, activate only as a sorcery and only once each turn. So this is a very unique enchantment to say the least. I mean, it does take inspiration from previous enchantments, and we'll go over those here in a bit, but yeah, very few enchantments actually enter with counters on them, number 1. Number 2, obviously this deals with modified creatures, which is a new thing from Kamigawa, so that's interesting. And number 3, this is just an enchantment that we can utilize to actually distribute counters, although, only at sorcery speed and once each turn, and I'm actually not going to argue against the once each turn this time. I mean, basically the concept is, yeah, you can make some of your creatures slightly bigger by giving them counters, and also by, helping them out by giving them haste too, so you can be more aggressive and swing right away. So obviously this has a good amount of applications. I mean, you can think about counters decks, you can think about decks that might use equipment or auras. Those decks are going to want a card like this. Giving your creatures haste is a very powerful thing for a deck that wants to be more aggressive. And then also, when it comes to actual counters decks that already have ways to interact with counters, this can be even more impactful, because there are definitely ways to get even more value out of that counter that you're distributing with this, and actually on top of that, there are ways to get even more counters on this as well. But yeah, overall for 3 mana in total, this gives you a good amount of value and can be really impactful in the right deck. That being said, before we talk about other things to consider, let's talk about what cards probably inspired this one. And the first card that definitely came to my mind is Fires of Yavimaya, and okay, also Rhythm of the Wild and Fervor. Fires of Yavimaya is an enchantment for the exact same cost, and it says, creatures you control have haste, sacrifice Fires of Yavimaya, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So essentially, this one obviously is different in some ways. It gives all your creatures haste no matter if they are modified or not. That being said, obviously it can't, distribute counters because that's not anything it does, but it can temporarily pump a creature. But to do so, you need to actually sacrifice this enchantment. And I don't know about you, but typically people don't sacrifice this, they'd rather just keep it in play to have your creatures have haste. Obviously in a pinch you could, but again, I think when it comes to actual utility, our new Invigorating Hot Springs has a bit more than this one, though again, it is more limited on, actually what creatures have haste. That being said, that limitation really isn't all that limiting when you think about, hey, okay, at least one per turn I can give one creature haste, and if you are getting, one creature per turn in play, essentially, you can just keep giving each creature haste that needs it. I guess up to 4, I should say. Regardless, another card that this definitely took inspiration from is Rhythm of the Wild, and it might be even more similar to this one. This is a fantastic enchantment for 1 red-green against those same price, and says creature spells you control can't be countered, so that's a thing, and it also says non-creatures you control have Riot. And Riot again means that they enter the battlefield with your choice of a +1 counter or haste. So I am not saying that Invigorating Hot Springs is better than Rhythm of the Wild. In fact, Rhythm of the Wild probably shouldn't have been an uncommon. I mean, creature spells you control can't be countered is fantastic, and also the, potential to either give your creatures a counter or haste is awesome too. That being said, obviously there are pluses and minuses to Rhythm of the Wild and Invigorating Hot Springs. Again, Rhythm of the Wild doesn't impact your token creatures, just your non-token ones, so you can't, give those creatures either a counter or haste, whereas you don't have that limitation with Invigorating Hot Springs. That being said, Rhythm of the Wild is essentially going to give any of your creatures, if you want to give them haste, it can give all of them haste as they come into play as long as they are non-token. Obviously, though, if you do choose to give them haste, they do not get a counter, whereas Invigorating Hot Springs is basically like, hey, you get both. Well, okay, at least one creature per turn for 4 turns, essentially, is going to get both. And obviously, again, Invigorating Hot Springs doesn't stop your creatures from being countered. But yeah, again, pluses and minuses for each of these cards. I mean, even a card like Fervor sees play in Commander, and yeah, it's just a simple enchantment that says creatures you control have haste. So yeah, giving your creatures haste is a very powerful thing. And Invigorating Hot Springs is another great way to do that. And like I said, there's also other synergies that you're going to want to take into account with it. For example, again, if you've got a deck that already utilizes a bunch of equipment or auras, well, a lot of your creatures are going to be modified, so on top of those counters that you can distribute to, modify further creatures, you're already having modified creatures in play, so why not give them haste with Invigorating Hot Springs? It can be especially effective with something like Sword of the Animus that has, equipped creature gets +1/+1, but more importantly, when it attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. So suit up a creature, again modifying it, so that you can swing away right away and ramp. Or, of course, with, a Voltron-style strategy, you probably have a Black Blade Reforged in that deck, so suit up your commander, give it +1/+1 for each land you control, and swing away to hit incredibly hard quickly. Or, of course, there's an aura like Rancor, which is going to give enchanted creature +2/+0 and trample, and when it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you return it back to its owner's hand. So this is definitely a way to kind of grant haste multiple times, again with the exact same card. Equipment typically can just do that on their own, obviously, but auras are usually just stuck to something and you usually don't get them back. But with this one, it's like, hey, this creature is temporarily larger, gets trample. When it's taken care of, then, well, I get this back. So then I can modify another creature and have it have haste thanks to Invigorating Hot Springs. But yeah, of course, another synergy and probably more likely one for this card is going to be with +1 counters with things like Hardened Scales, Branching Evolution, and Pure Imaginative Rascal to be considered. Hardened Scales is a fantastic enchantment that just costs a green, and it says if one or more +1 counters we put on a creature you control, that many +1 counters are put on it instead. Branching Evolution is somewhat similar. It says if one or more +1 counters we put on a creature you control, twice that many +1 counters we put on it instead. And Pure actually deals with all counters, saying if one or more counters we put on a permanent your team controls, that many +1 of each of those kinds of counters are put on that permanent instead. So there's a lot of different things that impact counters, and yeah, basically each of these with Invigorating Hot Springs means, hey, when you take that counter off your Hot Springs and you put it on a creature, instead of getting 1 counter on that creature, you get 2. So there are definitely ways that you can get even more value out of those counters and help your creatures hit even harder. I mean, again, at a base level, 3 mana to essentially distribute 4 counters and give your creatures haste, or again, give specific creatures haste, is a good amount of value. And again, with stuff like these, you can get even more. With just one of these in play, that's 8 counters being distributed, again, for just 3 mana. Now, again, obviously keep in mind that is counters over time being distributed, but still. Another thing to consider is most definitely proliferate effects. Again, if you're running a counters build, you probably already have proliferate effects in your deck, and this can help Invigorating Hot Springs in multiple ways. For example, Evolution Sage says whenever a land enters the battlefield on your control, proliferate, choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. So before you play your land for the turn, maybe take a counter off Invigorating Hot Springs, put it on one of your creatures, then you play a land. Cool, then you proliferate. So you say, okay, all these creatures that I have counters on, including the one that I just got a counter on, then I'm going to give them an extra counter. On top of that, Invigorating Hot Springs still has counters on it too, so I'm going to give it another counter. So yeah, with proliferate effects like this one, it can be very easy to keep stockpiling more and more counters on your Invigorating Hot Springs, so it essentially never runs out of counters. I mean, even a land like Karn's Bastion does it for you as well. Tap for a colorless or pay 4, tap to proliferate. So yeah, this is fantastic in countered builds. And another card that interacts in a really fun way with Invigorating Hot Springs is Sword of Truth and Justice. Again, this is an equipment, so just by having it equipped to a creature, that creature is going to be considered to be modified, and they're going to have haste. On top of that, of course, it gives equipped creature +2/+2 and protection from white and from blue. And then whenever equipped creature deals counter damage to a player, put a +1 counter on a creature you control, then proliferate. So again, this essentially modifies yet another creature for you, and on top of that, again, you can proliferate to get more and more counters on things, including Invigorating Hot Springs. Another thing to potentially consider in interacting with Invigorating Hot Springs is actually its interaction with, well, kind of like the opposite kind of counters with Persist. For example, Cauldron of Souls is a fantastic card, and it says choose any number of target creatures. Each of those creatures gains Persist until end of turn. So basically, when the creature dies, if it didn't have any -1/-1 counters on it, it comes back into play under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. So first off, this can be a great way to essentially save your entire team, and yeah, keep in mind that those creatures coming back into play with -1/-1 counters on them might be smaller, but again, they are now modified. Because again, it doesn't matter what kind of counter is actually on your creature, it can be any kind of counter, so yeah, now your creatures are modified and they have haste. And now with this, you can actually use your counters from Invigorating Hot Springs to kind of save your creatures even further. Though it does kind of demodify your creature, but still, that's fine if they've already, swung through and had haste and that was fine. Regardless, by, putting a +1 counter from your Invigorating Hot Springs onto that creature with a -1/-1 counter on it, well, then it doesn't have any counters. Both those counters cancel. So then if those creatures die again, well, you can Cauldron of Souls them again to give them Persist, and then they come back again. So yeah, Persist can be an interesting interaction, just consider other ones like, Woodfall Primus or Fury Stoked Giant as well that have ETBs and also have Persist. Woodfall Primus has when it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-creature permanent, and it's got Persist, so yeah, this is a great one to get back and remove that counter so you can do it again. And then Fury Stoked Giant is another interesting one. It says when it comes into play, other creatures you control gain tap. This creature deals 2 damage to target creature or player until end of turn. So yeah, give your creatures a way to ping either opponents or creatures, and yeah, again, you can take advantage of that Persist with something like this. And speaking of Persist, well, a commander that can definitely be pretty powerfully built with Persist, and a commander that should be considering Invigorating Hot Springs, how about Grumgully the Generous? It's a 3/3 Goblin Shaman for 1 red-green. They have that mana cost keeps coming up apparently in this episode, and it says each other non-human creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1 counter on it. So again, essentially, even just with this in Invigorating Hot Springs in play, all of your non-human creatures are already going to be coming into play with counters on them. And again, in a deck built around Grumgully, you're probably not going to have, well, any humans in the deck. So essentially, in combination, all those creatures have haste, and again, if you want to distribute more counters around with your Hot Springs, you can. Next up, how about Halar the Fire Fletcher, a 3/3 Trampling Elf Archer for, again, the same mana cost, 1 red-green. Halar has, whenever you cast a spell, if that spell was kicked, put a +1 counter on Halar the Fire Fletcher, then Halar deals damage equal to the number of counters on it to each opponent. So, the Hot Springs help out in multiple ways with this commander. Obviously, this commander can actually just get counters on itself, so hey, you're modified, you can just swing away and, yeah, have trample, have fun getting some damage through. On top of that, obviously, the more counters that you get on Halar, the more damage that it's going to be dishing out every single time you kick a spell. So, yeah, take those counters from Invigorating Hot Springs and put it on Halar and dish out some more damage. Next up, how about Omnath Locust of the Royal? And this one actually has a different mana cost, so here we go. A 3/3 Elemental for 1 green, blue-red. Omnath has, when it enters the battlefield, deals damage to any target equal to the number of elementals you control, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1 counter on target elemental you control. If you control 8 or more lands, draw a card. So yeah, this can definitely be a landfall elemental tribal type of commander, and yeah, now essentially, again, you've got easy ways to get counters on your elementals, so with Invigorating Hot Springs in play, you've got, some hasty elementals that can swing right away, and ways to get, them even larger if you'd like to distribute those counters from the Hot Springs. One final commander that I will bring up is more of like a Voltron-style commander. Well, a very interesting build for a Voltron-style commander with Thromok the Insatiable, which, okay, it's very, very different for a Voltron commander because it's like, hey, get a bunch of tokens out, then devour them. Let's just go through the card. It's a 0/0 Hellion for 3 red-green, and it says Devour X for X the number of creatures devoured this way. So again, yeah, get a bunch of tokens in play, devour a ton, get a ton of counters on this, and again, with your Hot Springs, sure, maybe just move 1 extra counter onto it as well just to make it slightly bigger. And of course, the more important part is that this is then modified, so it's got haste and you can swing right away. But yeah, obviously, even your more typical Voltronic commanders might want to be considering it as well, because yeah, you can just, pump your commander ever so slightly, and it's going to be able to swing right away. But now as this episode is coming to a close, it's time for me to give you my final thoughts on Invigorating Hot Springs. Yeah, this is a very interesting enchantment, and again, kind of a new take on that Fires of Yavimaya kind of blueprint. It definitely goes about it in an interesting and unique way, and it can benefit a good amount of decks out there. Again, decks that either, have a bunch of equipment, or auras, or, counter builds, are definitely going to want to consider this type of card. Granting your team haste is fantastic, and again, specifically for counter builds, there are ways to get more counters on this so you can distribute more counters with it, and also, of course, there's ways to, get more advantage out of getting those counters on creatures, by either doubling them up or, having other benefits for having counters on them, etc., etc., etc. Regardless, even more exciting cards should be coming out today, so make sure you stay tuned to this channel for, well, more spoilers on our last day of spoiler season. Well, our last day before, next week when we get the precons. The last official day of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, the set spoiler season. I'm rambling now. I'm sorry. I'm going to stop talking now. Goodbye. And with that, the show has come to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So make sure you comment below and let me know what your thoughts on this episode are. And as always, thanks again and have a good one.